I'm Kent Calder. I'm Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs here at SAIS, and I certainly want to welcome everyone here. This session is the third in a series that we hope will be continuing for a long time and contribute to Massachusetts Avenue and the intellectual life of SAIS as well. It's a series called the SAIS Faculty Research Forum. And the first and second events, we had Ling Chen had a book on China and globalization, how Chinese local governments respond to that. And then Liesl Hintz, oh, there she is right there, our distinguished second author in our series, who has a fascinating new book dealing with Erdogan's foreign policy and some of the domestic determinants of that. And then this is the third volume in our series. And I'm delighted that Francisco Gonzalez, who is Associate Professor of International Political Economy and also Latin American politics, of course, here at SAIS Johns Hopkins, that he is going to be presenting. He has had a distinguished career, both before joining the SAIS faculty in 2005, and then before that he taught at SAIS Europe in Bologna, and also was a lecturer in politics at St. John's College at the University of Oxford in the UK. He served as a postdoctoral fellow at Nuffield College, and he works not only, of course, on Latin America, so you know some of his work there, but also on global and regional energy issues, Sino-Latin American relations, and comparative politics. Being a Japanese politics specialist, I've been struck at the breadth of his interest in one-party dominance. The PRI, I guess, has certain, and its antecedents and successors, parallels elsewhere in the world, and he's been thinking about those issues as well. So without any ado, we'd like to hear from Professor Gonzalez.
Thank you, Kent. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks. Well, very good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for taking time off your very busy schedules. This is a very busy city, so making it here is something that I appreciate a lot. Thank you. This is the third book that I have written. It's the first single country book that I have written. I've tended to do comparative work, Mexico and Chile. Then I did a comparison of Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay between the Great Depression and the Great Recession. I've tended to analyze topics that have to do with the political impact of financial and economic crises, the political fallout of big crises. When I was working on that second book, the one on the Southern Cone, Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay, this is 2009, 2010, people started calling me from think tanks, from the media, my students, to talk more about Mexico. I'd gone a bit away from the country where I was born and where I was raised. And people were interested for relevant reasons, of course. The country had not only been deeply affected by the Great Recession, it had also fallen politically under dire circumstances. If by dire we mean a very significant rise in horrific violence, organized crime, bankruptcy in terms of the moral standing of the political class, corruption out of control, great cynicism in the part of civil society, a sense of hopelessness among many Mexicans. So I started looking with more care at my country. I started reading, listening, calling, and going more to Mexico. And from a variety of presentations, both here, different forums in DC, as well as in different universities, I ended up compiling quite a lot of material. So maybe around 2 years into this, I thought maybe there's the beginnings of a book here. The book finally came out this year. It was not meant to coincide with Andrés Manuel López Obrador's electoral victory or with the elections. That was just fortuitous. Hopefully it'll raise some more interest among the public. And let me start first. I'm not going to bombard you with hundreds of slides. I just want to touch on a few things. First, why the title? Why Misplaced Monopolies? It's 3 M's, and yes, I like alliteration. I like writing. I like paying attention to writing. I enjoy that. So it's Mexico under misplaced monopolies. What are these supposed misplaced monopolies? If we go back to our conventional social science, and this is prescriptive, it's almost common wisdom. It's what we've inherited as mainstream political science in the 20th century. When we think about the political sphere and effectively working state in a given territory, we say that the state requires to hold a monopoly over the legitimate use of coercion, of force, throughout its given territory, a given jurisdiction. So in the political sphere, a state that loses that monopoly can obviously give way to issues such as private individuals, private groups running amok, doing what they please, coercing, committing violence against their fellow countrymen, countrywomen, and that's obviously not a working state. That's not an effective state. Likewise, if we turn from the political to the economic sphere, there's also a consensus that some degree of economic competition tends to be required for countries to grow, to be prosperous. The idea of perfect competition is something that we just do in the whiteboard in a classroom. It doesn't exist in reality. And there are also natural monopolies. Discussed in the literature. There are industries that tend toward monopoly, very capital-intensive industries, utilities can easily become monopolies. But from liberal economic theory, from neoclassic economics, we hear that it's good for countries to have a modicum, different degrees in different sectors of the economy of economic competition. If that doesn't happen, then what tends to happen in those countries is that people who can abuse economic power, people who have monopoly power, duopoly, operate in a duopoly, an oligopoly, they tend to underproduce and overcharge, among other things. There's generally lower levels of employment created, but let's stick just with that, underproduction and overcharging. Whereas in the case of politics, without a working state, we end up with a situation in which there's a low degree of freedom, of basic physical security for individuals as well as for groups. As I looked at Mexico since the 1980s, and the 80s is really a watershed, not just in Mexico, but in the entire Latin American region, due to a dramatic, almost decade-long financial and economic crisis, when countries, regimes, be they military, be they civilian, came under very significant pressure from their societies, from international creditors, to change their models. So as I started looking at Mexico since the 80s, it became apparent that political and economic monopolies in the country, in fact, had been challenged. And this is the first. This is Latin America, mid-1970s. And you'll see most countries are on the side of authoritarian rule, authoritarian regimes of different flavors and colors. Some military led by a single general, some military led by a committee, some civilian led by hegemonic parties. So there were no, in terms of democracies, it's not that there was not a single one. Colombia was there, Venezuela was there, Costa Rica was there. I was interested in both political and economic change. And so therefore what I looked were countries that ended up undergoing these changes. Mexico was clearly under a state interventionist, protectionist economy and under authoritarian rule. For many, a very, in a way, successful type of rule because it was relatively soft authoritarian. The tanks were not out there well, hardly ever. Maybe they were brought out 2 or 3 times in the course of the late 60s, early 70s. The regime tended to co-opt opposition. It tried to offer inducements before resorting to force. But if it had to, it would resort to force and it could disappear individuals. Mexico has its own dirty war, which is nowhere near what happened in Argentina, in Chile, in Uruguay, nowhere near. But the regime was authoritarian. Come the 80s, there's, as I said, pressure, not just in Mexico, but in most other countries, to change political and economic rules in the face of the economic collapse, 1982, 83, followed by a long period of austerity. So fast forward a couple of decades, and most of these countries have embraced electoral democracy. I would not say liberal democracy, because the rule of law, individual rights are not necessarily guaranteed for the vast majority of individuals in a majority of the countries. But there's electoral democracy. Elections, on average, are free and fair. There's alternation at the top in these polities. So that's on the political side. And economically, of course, many of these countries were forced. Some people would say, well, they were not forced. New, younger, technocratic elites, in fact, took over, saw the mistakes of the previous 20, 30 years and decided to move in a more open direction to embrace globalization. The story is complicated and it has obviously elements of a variety of things, but certainly these economies were to different degrees opened up. They'd been very protected. They'd embraced import industrialization through substitution of imports with very strong state selective protection, and this ended up changing. So Mexico did move in that direction. The monopoly of power enjoyed by a regime that was in place for 7 decades started opening gradually through a series of negotiations between that party, the PRI, and both the traditional conservative party, the PAN, and a new left, which was invigorated in the face of this austerity, the PRD. So even though the country was moving in this direction, what's the problem then? It seems like, on average, conditions for individuals would have improved, both in the political sphere, as people can participate in the political process, in the economic sphere, in as much as the economy is opened up to some modicum of competition. So here, enter the framework that I used. So that was the reality, the conditions on the ground that I looked at. And I started looking for theoretical frameworks, for conceptual tools to try to explain this, to try to see the extent to which abstract knowledge out there could help me to understand why, even though Mexico had moved in that direction, the results on the ground were pretty subpar. And the majority of people would tell you, do you feel more free today than back in the 70s or in the 80s? And the majority of people would continue to say no. We feel, in fact, more unfree because violence has exploded. Now everyone lives in gated community, not just the rich, poor, middle, lower middle, upper middle. Everyone is in a cocoon. Everyone's scared. In the economy, yeah, great. We reached out and integrated our economy with North America, US and Canada through NAFTA. And the country remains one of the most unequal in the world. It remains today on the top 15% most unequal countries anywhere in the world, with very few people monopolizing incredible amounts of wealth, and the vast majority of people not having those capabilities to be able to develop their freedom. I came across a framework put together by a group of economic historians, political scientists, which gained a lot of attention, visibility in the early 2010s. And some of you have come across it, I'm sure. The effort was led by a Nobel Prize winning Douglas North, the institutional economics professor, by Barry Weingast at San Diego, by John Wallis. And they created a framework called Violence and Social Orders. And what they tried to do with this framework was to explain economic and political development across the world through analytical ways. So the idea was to try to generalize and provide, in a very abstract manner, conditions under which some countries have developed, reasons why, and likewise conditions for why a majority of countries have not, or are somewhere in between. So this framework tries to interpret progress, both political and economic, and it does so exactly by using the language of breaking down monopolies. It uses the language of microeconomics, of barriers to entry. How high or low are barriers to enter the political sphere, to compete for office, to express yourself, to gather with other people to discuss public affairs? How high or low are the barriers in the country to enter the labor market, to get an education that will lead potentially to a good, satisfactory job? So what they say is countries where barriers to entry have fallen tend to be those that have gained economic and political development, took off, and now are known as the advanced, mature capitalist economies. US, the English-speaking world, including Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the EU, and the opposite side, they call those countries, these are open access countries. There's open access for the average individual to participate in political and economic activity. The opposite, what they call limited access. And in that other perspective, countries that suffer from limited access are those where few dominate participation in both the political and the economic sphere. These are places which tend to be restrictive and where few exercise power and influence, and they basically decide and act for everyone else. And you can think from very extreme cases like North Korea, but you can also think cases somewhere in between where there is a modicum of participation that is allowed, I would suggest many Latin Americans fall under that category. But we're still on average, the median citizen of these countries is at a significant disadvantage compared to the political and or the economic elites in terms of opportunities to participate, opportunities to prosper from participating. So, okay, Mexico seems to be moving from A to B. Why did the country not become then an open access society? Why did the country become racked by violence, state penetration and capture by organized crime? Why did the country embarrassingly remain host, at least some years, to the richest individual on the planet, Carlos Slim, who's fallen behind to number 13, poor thing, in the last 4 or 5 years. Now really social media has just pushed forward. He'll never be again the top. That was very embarrassing for Mexico in the sense that more than 50% of the population live under the poverty line, and 20% still live under extreme poverty. I would expect that the richest individual in the world probably to come from Luxembourg or from Switzerland or from the United States of America. No? So this was the situation. What I then ended up doing was to try to poke at the framework of violence and social orders. And what I came up with was the idea that in their attempt to generalize and to provide this really powerful framework that in theory would explain political and economic development across places and across time, they'd overgeneralized. They'd simply talked about a political sphere and an economic sphere, and the recipe seemed to be, as countries lower barriers to entry, countries develop, prosper, there's a virtuous cycle that takes place, and these are the countries that move into take off and manage to become prosperous. Those who don't are unable to do this. Well, applied to Mexico, the problem was that in the political sphere, yes, we had more political competition and alternation in power through elections. That was good. But at the same time, we had the breakdown in order and security and a proliferation of indiscriminate and brutal violence. So good to open the political regime, bad to open through weakening and fragmentation of the state. So the what they consider just the political sphere, I said, this is too general. If we think about politics in terms of a political regime, but also a state, and those are distinctive, then lowering barriers in both, indiscriminately, can lead to a weak, fragmented state that does not enjoy the monopoly over the legitimate use of force and coercion through legality, through rule of law. That's exactly what happened in Mexico. In turn, in the economic sphere, while it was good to open up, in many ways, the closed economy had created, big fat rentiers, very cynical, corrupt individuals. So some measure of privatization, deregulation, opening to trade, investment, capital flows seemed to be good for the economy. But at the same time, the domestic economy remained heavily concentrated. The largest and the most important sectors in the economy remained relatively closed and dominated by monopolies, by duopolies, by oligopolies. So in the economic case, good to open to the international sector. Some would argue you opened up too indiscriminately, and after several financial crises in Mexico, and crises in East Asia, and crises in Russia, and in Turkey, and in Argentina, and everywhere else, people now are saying, beware about indiscriminately opening your capital account. controls, at least during periods of turbulence, are not bad. You know, for the IMF to have embraced that years ago was an incredible turnaround. They wouldn't have said any of this had there not been such dramatic financial crises throughout emerging markets in the world in the 1990s and the 2000s. So just to finish off, what I saw in Mexico happening was, yes, that competition in the political regime, which meant that Mexico became an electoral democracy. That party that was in power 7 decades was ousted. And as it percolates down, Mexico is a federation. We also saw governorships changing hands and a more plural country with governors on the left, on the center, on the right. At the same time, the state became weaker and violence took off in what probably not even the most pessimistic individuals back in the early 2000s thinking about the near future thought was going to happen in the country. And in the economy, good to have to compete, good to open to better, more efficient producers. Consumers benefited on average. Obviously, the domestic industry suffered quite significantly, but the opening helped to wipe out a lot of corruption, of inefficiencies, of entrenched vested interests. At the same time, what successive Mexican governments didn't do was to alter the domestic structure of the economy. And the economy remained characterized by domination. This is what an open access country would look like. There's an effective state, there's a rule of law, there's good law enforcement. In the open economy, there are different degrees of competition, and more often than not, the many, not just the few, prosper. This is Mexico, limited access order. On the one hand, a horrendous symptom of the weak, fragmented state. That's only one symptom. The proliferation of feminicidio, feminicide, gender violence, which takes off dramatically in the 1990s. I can talk about that during Q&A. Private individuals and groups can be a law to themselves and do what they want with others. That's unacceptable. And on the other, a very concentrated economy. You know, the man who came to represent this monopoly power, Mr. Slim, but he's obviously not the only one. Here we have Pemex, our energy sector, monopolized by a state-owned enterprise, rife with corruption, posting negative profits for 2.5 decades, and successive governments milking the company and the industry to the bone, more often than not for political purposes, not to reinvest in the business, not to keep competitive. Banking, the country is one of the this is a bit dated, the numbers have not changed significantly. Mexico is one of the countries with lowest levels of domestic credit provision when you think about emerging economies, when you think about developed countries. Telecoms, Mr. Slim, and so we see low penetration of telecom and very high prices. Those rents over there, right-hand side, is what made Mr. Slim the richest man on earth. It was a protected market. Visual media, managed by two giant firms, both of which also, given the power of media, help to shape political preference, shape political debate. So they are very powerful. Politicians are scared of them, in particular in the run-up to elections. They can make or break reputations. And on the side of the state, and with this I'm going to finish, what we see is, compared to Japan, to Germany, to China, to France, to all these countries which have less than 10 per 100,000 homicides, per 100,000 inhabitants of homicides. Japan might be unique, and Germany also. But look at the U.S. The U.S. is very diverse, and there are places, there are parts in the U.S. which are very violent. The U.S., at around 4, Great Britain at 1. Mexico's roller coaster with from 16 to 20 to 24 to 26 per 100,000, and that is something which is a very serious symptom of state failure. So that is why Mexico, in my view, is under misplaced monopolies. It's not a cheerful topic, but I think it's the reality of the country in the recent past, and in my estimation, will continue to be the case at least in the short term. Nothing lasts forever, thankfully. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I know I, as a comparativist, saw a lot of parallels with other countries that I know in the developing world, and as the industrialized, and some of you who also study developing countries becoming industrialized, I think you will probably saw some had some sense of recognition there as well. As our commentator today, we have someone who has a extremely broad background, not only with respect to Mexico, but with many parts of the world. Richard Miles, who is going to be our commentator here, is the director of the U.S.-Mexico Futures Initiative, which I'm sure keeps him busy over at CSIS just across the way. He's also deputy director of the Americas program for the Americas as a whole at CSIS. And he has spent time in various parts of Latin America. He has 20 years of experience as a Foreign Service officer and also as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Army. He served in Argentina, Barbados, Germany, with a provincial reconstruction team in Iraq. And I also thought just to indicate his diversity, he was assigned to the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Germany that later was assigned to take part in Desert Storm. And his unit was one of the leaders in the coalition attack against the Iraqi armed forces in Iraq. He has a BA in Russian Studies from the University of Washington, and then an MS from Georgetown, but we're happy to admit him here anyway.
Thank you.
Of course, we do also, one of our colleagues respect one of our fellow institutions here. He's fluent in both Spanish and German, and we look forward to your comments, Richard. Thanks.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate the opportunity to comment on Francisco's book. And Francisco asked me to be brutally honest, so here comes Francisco. I really like your book. So that's. No, I found it very helpful. It was a very, very concise yet a detailed description, which is hard to do, of the power structures in Mexico, whether those power structures are political, economic, or criminal. And the idea of misplaced monopolies, I thought, was a very elegant way to describe the two biggest failures in Mexico at the current time. One is a government that can't seem to do anything about violence, and number two is an economy that is suffocated by cronyism and connections. And Francisco filled in a lot of gaps in my knowledge and my understanding of sort of who has done what to whom and when they did it, particularly in the cartel violence, and then that relationship to the decline of the pre and the rise of the PAN in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so I tend to study and focus on the security side of things, so I was particularly found helpful his chapters, one entitled Wealth and Violence, another one on why has Mexico become so violent. And this is, I think, really important work because Francisco describes in detail sort of the specific links between the state control, or really loss of state control at the federal level and then the state levels, and then the corresponding rise of cartel influence and violence. And that connection and trying to understand is hugely important to policymakers. And so this is not a subject that we're going to hear less about over the next 6 years, I guarantee you. And just an example, the new Mexican president, Lopez Obrador, who just took office on Saturday, he really based almost his entire campaign on reducing violence and corruption. I mean, there are other issues that came up and were discussed, but surprisingly, things like relations with the United States was a low topic of interest in the Mexican campaign, which surprised me. Other issues, even like trade and so on, were just way down the ladder. It was violence and corruption. And so in his very first meeting, Lopez Obrador basically dealt with security issues, his first cabinet meeting. And his first day in office, he said the military would continue in its public security role, which is a decision not without controversy in Mexico, but really one of necessity, because the police force is just not, at all levels, federal, state, and local, is not capable of dealing with the levels of violence that we've seen. And he's proposed the creation of a new National Guard that would include elements of military and law enforcement. And so understanding, Francisco's will help me more understand how we arrived at that point, where you have a person of the left, longtime person of the left, essentially adopting a continuation of the same policies that were started under the two relatively conservative governments. And a lot of that's just dealing with the reality of what Mexico is today and the limited tools available. And it struck me that in the book, Francisco talks about basically a trade-off that happened in which the PRI during the 80s and 90s had the dominant party dominated society, dominated everything in Mexico, and through that dominance, it could essentially tamp down cartel violence when it needed to. So it's not that there wasn't drugs or drug traffickers or cartels, there were, but the PRI could respond in such a way through its control in the states of the governors at a low level. They could essentially deal with it a lot of times because they knew and socialized and were basically in bed with the drug traffickers. So they could deal with it. When that situation sort of came apart in the mid-90s where the PRI lost its influence, all of a sudden you had the situation where governors did not have as much influence. They weren't as responsive to the federal government or to the PRI as a party, and the cartels saw an opportunity and they moved in. And it's not a question of simply reasserting that dominance, because that's what President Calderon and Peña Nieto tried to do without a lot of success. So unfortunately, it's not like a spigot. You just turn on state control and down goes cartel violence. And it's a system, I think, that dissipated and collapsed and may not come back. So this obviously has huge implications for Mexico's relationships with the United States. The Merit Initiative, which probably a number of people are familiar with, started under Presidents Bush and Calderon. Started out as about a $4 billion package of security assistance, a mix of sort of hard assistance like helicopters and Humvees, and then soft side, known as soft side assistance, things like judicial sector reform, help for courts, judges, prosecutors, public defenders, training. And unfortunately, that didn't really deliver the results that policymakers thought it would be, which would be to reduce violence. And there was an initial dip. If you look at the statistics in 2009, 2010, but those numbers started going up, and then last year we had the highest number on record of violent homicides. So what did it do, though? Through that program, it ironically, although it did not accomplish the objectives, it did strengthen the relationship between the United States and Mexico at a fundamental level, from senior military officers all the way down to, essentially street cops. Because you've had at least a decade now of very intense, deep relationships between the military forces, between security forces, between civilian agencies. And I would argue that that has acted as a buffer now, so that despite what we saw in 2016 in our own presidential campaign and in early 2017, the rhetoric coming out of the White House, the U.S.-Mexico relationships, the bilateral relationship is surprisingly in good shape. much, much better than anyone would have predicted. And I think it's because you've had that layer of relationships at senior military, senior civilian agency levels that has helped keep that in place. I'll just give you one statistic to show you the difference. From 2001 to 2008, if you count the number of bilateral military exercises that Mexico participated in, U.S.-led, there are 2. Since 2008, there have been 46. So we're talking exercises in the Caribbean and the Pacific in the United States, joint conferences together. So it's really a fundamental transformation, and that is reflected in the fact that the political relationship did not go off track in 2016 and 2017. It's still in good shape. I mean, I don't think anyone would have been able to predict that, for instance, Jared Kushner would get the highest civilian award on Peña Nieto, and that was a very controversial decision. But if you'd even proposed that idea in early 2017, correct me if I'm wrong, Francisco, I think you would have been laughed, off the stage to think that that's even a possibility. Yet it happened, and now it's a reflection of a real reality. Like it or not, Jared Kushner did play a fundamental role as an interlocutor for the White House and the Mexican Foreign Secretary and senior levels of the Mexican government. So that was not just some throwaway nice thing to have. He did really play a significant role in that, which is kind of amazing. But so the dynamic, as I was saying, by the time the federal government tried to take control, the Mexican federal government in 2000 under Vicente Fox, it was essentially too late. A lot of the PRI's soft power and hard power had gone away, and the PAN could not bring it back, and the PRI couldn't bring it back. Right. So I think the work that you've done, Francisco, has really made that quite clear in a way that I hadn't really thought about that dynamic before. So I think the big question for policymakers is, what is the answer if the old system is gone and if militarization doesn't really work, doesn't deliver the result? And so what we've seen so far from López Obrador, his strategy to me is not entirely clear. At this point, seems to be a continued presence of the military, not much of a surprise. Some sort of National Guard, we don't know what that would look like yet. Maybe some sort of amnesty for cartel leaders and cartel members. Again, we don't know what that looks like. And then some sort of decriminalization of drugs, presumably not all drugs, some drugs. So that policy hodgepodge may work. We'll see. But I think it avoids the real solution. Francisco talks about this in his book. Really, fundamentally, I think we have to see a strengthening of Mexico's non-political institutions or non-partisan institutions that build up a rule of law culture. That is really, I think, fundamentally what is going to transform the country. That certainly includes the courts, police, prisons, prosecutors, public defenders, and so on, but also institutions like the free press, civic associations, honest businesses, the church, families and individuals. I mean, it's really the whole society. Because laws and policies only work when citizens believe in them and act on them. And I think that's Mexico's biggest challenge. Francisco sums it up well. I'm going to quote from his book. He says, "The rule of law has probably never existed in Mexico because it has always been a function of personal connections, privileged access, and lopsided regulation and policies which have benefited the few, powerful, rich, and influential at the expense of the vast majority of citizens who have not enjoyed any of these benefits." So Francisco does not provide any answers, any easy answers, because it turns out there aren't any easy answers. But nevertheless, congratulate you on this book, Francisco. Very, I think, important work, and it will be widely read by many policymakers.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, well, it's fascinating. I think it fascinates a lot of us that one can see so much persistence over the years in what looked like a perverse situation, the cartels, for example.
Right.
Well, the misplaced monopolies, literally, that Carlos Slim can continue to be as wealthy as he is, even to the richest man in the world, as you mentioned, and then that the drug violence and cartels can just persist, all of which I found quite fascinating. I don't know anything about Latin America. My last book was something called Circles of Compensation. It's about Japan and a few other countries. I guess I looked at Germany and Korea and Singapore, but of course no place in Latin America. But you talk about monopolies. It just resonated so hauntingly. Um, but I wanted to ask you a question that I also asked myself. Why these organizations that seemingly are so perverse, why do they persist so strongly? Is it because of a weak state? I guess you alluded to some of that. And then they continually sort of resurface. You can send the military out and try to do something, but then, or you can arrest one of the kingpins, but then they still recover and revive.
Yes, I would not want to just keep hammering, oh, misplaced monopolies, and every answer to every question
Is
would
it
be,
because
it's
they've
misplaced monopolies.
co-opted the leadership?
It's first and foremost because it delivers super profits in a country where more than 50% of the economically active population makes a living in the informal sector. So no entitlements, few benefits. People get by doing 2 or 3 different jobs here and there. Everyone I wouldn't say the median household, but 30% poorest individuals, mom, dad, granny, uncle, children, everyone is contributing. The social safety net is the family. There's very low trust outside the family, given the cronyism, given the systematic abuse of power by authorities. So there's really an industrial reserve army, Kent, out there of, in particular, young people willing to play the lottery of, what's the likelihood that under the current system as it is, I will manage to prosper. I will manage to move on, move up, myself, my family. If I am not one of these connected, influential, networked people, the probability is low to very low. What is the probability of joining organized crime and making a lot of money, at least for a couple of years? And then, if I'm lucky, a little bit lucky, I might even live 2 or 3 more. It's that cynical. Individuals are aware that their average life in the business is under 5 years. Once you get in. And I wouldn't say they're happy to play it. The system pushes many to play that game. The narcocultura has strong and deep roots. Musically, there's a very, very influential genre, and there are many PhDs in anthropology, in ethnographic studies, on narcocorridos, particularly many universities in Texas, in California. So American-based academics have gone into this. The lifestyle, the incredibly baroque and overabundant style of these individuals who, have.
So you've got, to take, of course, a lot of people think of the Hirschman paradigm of, exit, voice, and loyalty. There's strong incentives for either exit, I guess, is leave the country or somehow opt out of the system, and not much incentive for voice to resist the system, but loyalty to one element or another, either to the drug cartel or to some part of the establishment. You don't have the incentives to oppose the system effectively.
Absolutely.
Is that it?
It's a good analogy. It's a good way of ordering the information. Loyalty, who to? Immediate family? people who are considered part of the extended family. There are clans in Mexico, and padrinos, godfathers, godmothers. The religious element plays there a very important cementing role in creating lifelong loyalties and exchange of duties and benefits. So loyalty to that, loyalty to the firm. The firm can be General Electric or BBVA, Banco Bilbao Vizcaya, but that's for the crust of those who managed to had access to tertiary education, which are very few. The vast majority of the rest, the loyalty is to the firm, and the firm, in many cases, is and has become and continues to be organized criminal organizations.
Well, it's a depressing sort of set of prospects, and we haven't, you stress civil society and new institutions, as Richard had said, but then those are difficult to develop. That's kind of a depressing prospect. I know there are people who know Mexico much better, certainly, than I, and the floor is open on this interesting book. Yes, please. If people could identify
Here you go.
themselves.
Thank you. Chris Bruno, I'm an alumnus from '95.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much. I look forward to buying and reading your book. One comment I have is the increase in violence hasn't coincided with, in a sense, a movement away from a duopoly where you had the Gulf Cartel and the Zetas essentially controlling their territory, where it's broken down so you have many more actors fighting it out for territory, something like the favelas in Brazil, where you have two gangs. If one gang controls a favela, the violence is reduced. When they come in contact with each other, the violence goes up.
Correct.
Isn't an answer to move towards a monopoly in the drug?
Right.
Yeah.
So these illegal markets work exactly as you mentioned it. There was a time in Mexico in the late 1980s when the main capos, the main kingpins, were in fact allotted a region by the then godfather, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. Most of these kingpins, by the way, you look at their trajectory, they at some point served as policemen or as military, and at some point came to be connected with politicians, particularly at the local or the state level. Many of these people were, for example, bodyguards. The godfather was the bodyguard of the governor of the state of Sinaloa, which is the state, one of the states that produces the highest amounts of poppies for heroin. Used to be also cannabis country, much less these days in the light of competition from the US with much better product, I'm told. But certainly what you see in the early 90s is the breakdown of the agreements that these capos, these kingpins, had reached with the padrino, who's in jail, you know, in a golden cage, if you want. And they start fighting over product and territory. In Mexican parlance, they start fighting over plazas, la plaza. And according to the people who look at this in great detail, it is the case that be it cities, be it ports of entry or ports of exit, the border towns of the US are crucial, critical. When there's a top dog, the other groups who accept the top dog usually just pay to use the territory, pay to use the services of the top dog, pay security just like peaceful civilians. If that top dog is brought down and there's internecine conflict within that organization, those are moments ripe for takeover, both within the cartel and between them. So it is certainly the case that, just as you were referring to the case of the favelas, when one of these big drug trafficking organizations is on top of basically law and order, they participate in elections mostly through financing. According to some estimates, maybe upwards of 40–45% of Mexican municipalities, close to 2,500 municipalities, so 40–45% are under the control of criminal gangs. The first thing they do, they don't necessarily run for office themselves, but they make the offer of plata o plomo, silver or lead, and people who are principled and who decide not to play the game are killed. The local press is full of daily news of politicians, of attorneys massacred throughout the country for not playing the game. The first thing that these people do when someone is willing to play the game and wins the election is to have veto over the selection of who's going to be the police chief in the territory. That is reproduced at the governor level, and according to intelligence sources here in the United States, kind of back of envelope calculation would say that a third of the 31 plus mayor of Mexico City, so 32 heads of executive, around a third don't play the game, are principled, are under great pressure. Some have sent their families overseas. Another third are on the fence. They maybe have some scruples over what's going on, but the silver or lead offer is irresistible, so it's an unstable equilibrium. A third, maybe plus, are part of them. So certainly a criminal sphere gains stability by the establishment of a monopoly over the use of violence, force, and coercion. From the perspective of political science, one would expect that to be the state. One would expect that to be officers, officials elected by the public, accountable to the public, part of the public. The public can take part in this process. Sadly, in Mexico, the situation is one where fragmentation continues to have the upper hand, and that has to do quite a lot with what Richard said, which is that irrespective of who's been in power since the mid-2000s, and we've had, conservative party, more catch-all, pragmatic party, the pan on traditional, Catholic, liberal in economics, the PRI catch-all. They, in theory, knew it all, and they would be able to reconfigure this system, which, as Richard very poignantly puts it, this was an intricate, complex system of social and political relations, which once it dissolved, it could not be put back together. There was no way back. And proof of that is that the PRI returned. I remember in the run-up to the elections of 2012, Mexicans were very scared and very cynical. And so some of the things that they were saying is, well, obviously to fight the mafia, you need the mafia. So we kicked these people out for 12 years. The PAN, who were, let's assume, well-intentioned, good people with civic values, some of them, at least at the beginning, didn't want to play that game. Some of them were gunned down. The system was obviously overcome by the firepower, the capacity of these people, this vast inequality which gives them significant shock troops for very little, given the structure of the economy. Given that that didn't work, let's bring back the old mafia, who will incorporate these guys back into the old system of live and let live. That was impossible. There was no telephone that someone could get and call the padrino. There were already many padrinos fighting against one another, and the strategy followed, the decapitation strategy. Let's go after the heads of the cartels. That will help to weaken them, and we can rein them in. That simply did the opposite of what you're saying and exacerbated violence. It's incredible, as Richard noted, that finally the political electoral compass moves to the left for the first time since the 1930s, and the president, seeing the situation as it is on the ground, in fact does not signal a change, says this strategy will continue because stepping back will make things worse. And that, of course, is a huge counterfactual. Will it? He's not willing to play the game and see if that is the case.
I see you've got another question right here. One there and then one there. Okay.
Sir?
I'm a retired OECD official and a great fan of Mexico, mainly but not
Do you want to use a mic, or are you?
Yes, I'm a great fan of Mexico, mainly but not only because my wife is Mexican and we visit there often. Now, you paint a very dire picture of the country, and the key question seems to be what can be done about it. Now, there is a country where the level of violence was much higher and the drug cartel penetration and influence was higher, and that's Colombia. And they, I'm not going to say they solved their problem, but they improved their situation significantly. I'm wondering whether Mexico can learn from whatever Colombia did to come to grips with the situation. And more specifically, if the new president would call you as an advisor, do you have any blueprint? What can be done? What would you do about the situation? After having studied the dire situation, is there anything in your repertoire to recommend any solution? And I would address that same question to your commentator.
Okay.
Maybe if we might, because we're getting fairly close to the end, could we take your question too, and then maybe have our two commentators comment?
Okay. Well, thank you. My name is Alejandro Valerio. I'm an analyst focused on Mexico. I work at Frontier Strategy Group with many of your alumni, Pablo Gonzalez. So first, congratulations on your book. It's actually going to be quite helpful for those who work with a wonderful country as is Mexico. My question goes in that direction. I think the title, like Mexico under Misplaced, Monopolies, how do you see that, forward-looking, from now until 2024, if you see, the next monopoly is going to be Morena? And I say that because AMLO, the policies that he's taking, for example, reshuffling the social spending programs, looking ahead with an electoral strategy, and look how he's handling the 2019 budget, secret state after he running an ambitious government spending platform. But he's going to be dealing with an external environment that is not going to be easy, maybe a U.S. recession, weak oil prices, and in addition, that it would be hard, he's not going to be able to shift the manufacturing, export-driven economy to the petro-state agrarian, more or less what he would have in mind. So how do you see moving forward if he's going to be able to achieve that, or we're going to be heading more like Echevarria, Portillo style by the end of 2024? Thank you.
Okay. Very interesting questions. The Colombian analogy in the future, I guess.
Thank you.
The two
I'll start. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the two questions. The Mexico-Colombia analogy is something that, in fact, in class we do a simulation about the two countries' strategies, the extent to which the Colombia model applies to Mexico. The answer is mostly no. The reasons for this have to do with I'd say maybe 2-3 factors. First, the Colombian state was traditionally very weak. The Colombian state did not have physical presence throughout its territory up until Plan Colombia, up until the United States helped to prop up security services. This is a country that had on purpose had a relatively small and underfunded military exactly to keep the temptations of military coups so prevalent in Latin America, low probability. It was a country that always prided itself about its civilian politics, about having a two-party system like the United States, and playing politics in that way. By the way, pretty elitist. The two parties represented mostly the elite. In Mexico, you've had a state that has presence throughout the territory. It has presence in the 2,500 municipalities. What happened to that state is that it was penetrated by organized crime. And there's a key difference between organized crime in Mexico and in Colombia. In Colombia, not all of them, but at least the guerrillas and the paramilitaries, those two big groups, were in it, yes, for the profit, but also for political motives. The main issue was the guerrillas saying, we're going to plant our flag, change the constitution, and create a Marxist state in Colombia. And we're going to redistribute land, and we're going to give land to the indigenous, to the poor. It was a political project. And the paramilitaries project was also political. We're going to do everything it takes not to allow these Marxists to take over. In Mexico, that is not the case. In Mexico, these are businessmen. It's very difficult even to identify them. If you're a guerrilla in Colombia, you were out there in the bush with fatigues, practicing. These people dress like me or you. And they leave home with one cap and come back with the same cap. But the day job that they have, maybe the wife, the children, they don't even know what job they have. This has percolated throughout society. Some analyses say that upwards of 800,000 people participate in the drug trafficking world in Mexico. I don't consider that alarmist. To me, it sounds perfectly reasonable. Many of these people are MBAs, are economists with PhDs, they are public accountants who are moving the money, who are doing the money laundering. The US and Colombia could go into the jungle and attack guerrilla camps. Where do you hit the cartels? They don't have headquarters like corporations. They are all over the place. They are enmeshed in rich, middle class, poor neighborhoods around the country. It's much worse than a guacamole, that thingy. It's like that with 3 million. They, as Ken was saying, they go under, if pressure comes, keep a low profile, then they go back to business. And an important thing, unlike the Colombian paras or the Colombian guerrillas who wanted high visibility, high public visibility, because that was part of their strategy to push their project, these people in general, they are, more often than not, the majority are not the blood-hungry, thirsty fiends who love to just kill. They're businessmen, they're keen businessmen, and they know that violence disrupts business. They'd rather not have to fight against one another or against government forces than do it. If they do it, business activity comes down because there's going to be federal and state intervention if there's a massacre. So the great difference is Colombia political targets could be relatively well identified. In Mexico, it's part of the social tissue. And they are there and they're here. We Mexicans have the right to have dual citizenship. I carry 2 passports. And there are more than 25 million Mexican Americans. I would have thought that 10.1 have to do with this business. But those who do, and when you look at the biographies of these people, it runs in the family. It's 4, 5, 6 generations who started up in the Sierra as poor farmers. And today their great-great-grandchildren have been to do MBAs in top American universities and are in the family business. How do you attack that? It's not possible. What would I tell the president? President, you've inherited, I would not like to be in your shoes, you've inherited a devil's kiss. Good luck.
And that relates
No.
to,
No.
so to 2024, that's the answer to your question. The other question about the future, right?
Yes. Not necessarily worsening, no civil war, no success, unless there was a way to reestablish the live and let live approach, unless internationally the anti-narcotics regime changed significantly to lower very, very significantly those super profits for which there are always going to be poor kids willing to give their lives over in Mexico as elsewhere.
Richard?
And then I'm going.
Yeah, I would add just 2 things. One, I agree almost entirely with Francisco in terms of the difference between Colombia and Mexico, with one exception. The presence of the paramilitaries fundamentally changed the way that we approach the problem in Colombia with the FARC and the ELN and so on. It made it much more of a classic military target. But there was a time, 2006, 2007 specifically, when parts of Mexico started to look a little bit like that. In the north, you had these raging battles between the cartels and going in and wiping out entire towns and actually seizing some territory. So to U.S. and Mexican policymakers at the time, it started to look a lot like Colombia. And that's why they designed Merit Initiative was really kind of based on Plan Colombia, the same sort of mix of we're going to give you helicopters and intelligence support and a whole bunch of military type of aid to fight what sort of looked like a military threat. Turns out that wasn't really true. It's for all the reasons Francisco said. It wasn't a paramilitary or a terrorist organization holding on to large chunks of land that you could attack with military forces. But it looked a little bit like that, and close to the U.S. border. So that's what set off the alarm bells.
Right.
Well, I don't know. I think there's a big the sense of exhaustion in the U.S. policy community for all these reasons. So I think if the Mexicans come to them and say we need to rethink our strategy, I think the U.S. will go like we do. I think one factor that is interesting that may change the dynamics a little bit, and I'm just really speculating here, is a lot of people in the counter-drug business think that they're already seeing now that synthetic drugs are kind of the wave of the future, right? So if you game it out a little bit, I mean, remember, heroin only came back as a response to the fact that prescription drugs got more expensive because we clamped down on them.
Yeah.
So if you reverse that equation, if all of a sudden synthetics are coming in the United States via China, a lot of them are coming through Mexico, but if all of a sudden the market gets flooded with synthetic drugs of all sorts, you can probably expect that demand for plant-based drugs across the board is going to start to fall. And we've already seen the cartels essentially getting out of the marijuana business. There's just not enough money in it anymore. Well, you could speculate that maybe that will happen to heroin and cocaine, and so a lot of that market-driven will eventually go away. That all depends on, are synthetics really going to take hold? Are they going to become so cheap that traditional heroin producers just get out of the business if there's no money in it anymore? I don't know. That's just gaming it out.
If I may just quickly
sure.
Respond to Alejandro, because most of the conversation, and it's the way it went, has had to do with the misplaced monopoly of the caving in of the state and its capacity to enforce the law, its capacity to retain this monopoly over the use of force. We've talked much less about the other side, the economic sphere, the very concentrated structure of the economy. And that goes to Alejandro's question. During this last administration, 2012 to 2018, significant reforms were implemented in these areas, in the areas that I showed you. Energy, oil and gas in particular, telecoms. Mr. Slim is going to have to face some competition. The duopoly in visual media, less open given their strong lobbying and political influence, but there are going to be more licenses, some more channels out there. Financially, there were a couple of reforms to incentivize growth of credit, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises. So one could argue that the last government, which had a very solid technocratic base, pushed and created a political consensus that managed to unlock reforms, to open up some of these sectors which had been closed and had favored, you know, the only or the two or the few players for 25 years. It's too early to tell if they're going to be successful, but all of these areas have competent regulatory authorities, staffed by technocrats. We've seen significant growth in the participation of, say, in telecoms, non-Mr. Slim businesses. AT&T, Telefónica of Spain have grown in the last 2-3 years. Oil, which was a sacred cow no one would touch in Mexico for 50 plus years, has been opened. There are more than 90 contracts that have been awarded, licenses to operate. And you count all the big names and smaller names, the ExxonMobils, the Shells, European Total, Eni, Japanese, South Korean firms. That seems to have at least created the beginnings of a move towards watering down economic monopoly power that these leaders in these sectors milked so successfully for such a long time. López Obrador, as you clearly and rightly say, is someone who, in terms of economic thinking, is more old school. He believes in a bigger public sector. He believes in public investment. He believes in the participation of private sector through concessions, but through state-led initiatives. And the way you finished your question, the question was, might this be the return to, and he mentioned two presidents, 1970s and up to 1982, a period which in the economic history of Mexico is known as the years of neopopulismo. Still under PRI hegemony, but a lot of state monopolies and a lot of state domination. It is very difficult to see this government, even though it has majorities in both chambers of Congress, to roll back these reforms. These reforms would require 2/3 in each of the chambers, plus a simple majority of all the state legislatures. So we're talking about 32 legislatures. And the PAN and the PRI still control around 20. There are, unless he decided to say al diablo con las instituciones, you know, institutions to hell, and I'm going to do this just through a public consultation, which I will arrange. Okay, in this audience, 20 people, 15 raise their hand, we move ahead. Unless he does that, and he's tried to do it with a controversial airport project, to try to touch these other much bigger reforms is something that would create very short-term costs against him as people pull their money out from Mexico. The Mexican state is hollow. It can look strong from the outside. Politicians are, their mustaches are incredible and they're very macho. And the truth is that the state is very weak. It collects around 15% to GDP of resources, compared to 30, 35 on average for OECD countries. So for all his goodwill, he does not have that money to do so. He has, in a way, that the dice are loaded by the structure of the world economy and the state of globalization today. And Mexico is highly dependent. Mexico is a price taker in terms of capital. It remains a capital scarce society. If López Obrador wants to deliver a modicum of social reforms that can bring down the Gini index of inequality, that provide better education, particularly for those moving from secondary to tertiary, create public goods such as roads, potentially some railways to move trade, he cannot just shun and spit in the face of capital. He can't. And if he does, the country is going to suffer the consequences in the very short term. This is not the world of the 1970s.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we've all learned a lot from this. I can see we also have some coffee and other things to continue the discussion. Congratulations.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you, Richard. Thank you, everybody.